Russia must build democracy on its own terms. It can't copy our model. And of course, what it does is it doesn't build democracy at all. With time, Russia has come to define its political system very much in opposition to the Western model. The Western model and its values that goes along with it, such as rule of law, human rights and freedoms, etc. What perhaps I think one of the speakers earlier referred to as our common platform. With the return of Putin to the presidency in 2012, this gradual development towards authoritarianism gathered speed. And with the annexation of Crimea, it accelerated even further. Russia's ideological conflict with the West is essentially about rejecting the West, its values as degenerate, as imposed from the outside and alien to what they refer to as the Russian world, Ruski mir. And the Russian world, of course, is larger than just Russia. We don't know exactly how big it is, but it certainly encompasses Ukraine. And so in Russia's mind, our values are alien to Ukraine. Russia takes it upon itself to make that interpretation. You could, in a sense, argue that this is a non-ideology, but the challenge is ideological because it rejects the very basis for how we built our society. I think it's impossible to understand where Russia is now unless you go back a few years and think about the demonstrations in 2011, 2012. We tend to forget this now, but it's only about 3 years ago that the picture that we had of Russia was a completely different one, and the Russian trajectory, actually. It came as a surprise to us, but arguably it came as a surprise to the Russian leadership as well. And I'm pretty sure that this is the specter that the Kremlin is afraid of. A popular protest that develops into a social movement, a tide that can't be stopped. This is the specter of the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, but also the fall of the Iron Curtain and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This is how the Russian leadership interprets what happened in 2011, 2008. And in this, I absolutely agree with Ambassador Tarka, who said that Russia is driven also from a position of weakness and fear, not just a position of strength. So this brings me to my second point. I mean, why is a system that prevents modernization and economic growth, that makes reform impossible, where repression is a necessity, why should it be attractive at all? I mean, for some of the neighboring countries, or the elites in these neighboring countries, I would say it's the only option available. In certain countries, I also think that some elites are attracted to Putin as a strong leader, and they're lured by the tempting prospect of not having to deal with elections or a media that asks difficult questions. But the Putin model is also very anti-Western, and more specifically, it's anti-American. And this appeals to parties on the far left, as was mentioned by Ambassador Luke earlier, but also to many on the far right. Those who don't want to see their country in the EU, who want to see more of national sovereignty. Furthermore, Russia has made a bid to represent the real Europe, as opposed to Gay Europa, as they call us on the media. They claim to have returned to family values, to tradition, and this, again, appeals to certain conservative parties. At the same time, there are clear limits as to how attractive this is. The idea of a Russian world that can absorb other nations, as some debaters in Russia say, is difficult to stomach even to most nationalists who might have been attracted by the conservative aspect of Russia's bid to us. Even authoritarian presidents like Lukashenko and Nazarbayev are less amused by some of Russia's overtures to their respective countries. The Kremlin embrace is not an alliance, it's rather domination that they offer inside the Eurasian Union. And very few countries, I would say, are genuinely attracted by the economic model that Russia offers. Ambassador, you mentioned that we hadn't talked about the economy. I mean, for me, it's absolutely clear that the Russian economic model is moribund. And of course, this is a power in decline. It's not a very good soft power tool to use. So just to conclude, we need to recognize that Russia's bid to change the European security architecture has an ideological aspect as well as a geopolitical one. Russia wants to gain recognition for its corrupt economic system without rule of law, for its political system without free elections with a viable alternative and human rights and freedoms as equally valid. And this is what Russia offers the countries that it wants to see in its sphere of influence. In effect, this would signify for these countries to give up their national sovereignty, if not territory. And it's just as bad as giving up territory. They will not be allowed to choose their economic policy, but also not which security arrangements they want to have for their country. And I just want to echo Ambassador Volker, who said that the right of each European state to make its own choice, that was part of the European security architecture, and it's a vision that we need to keep on to. All European countries have this right, Ukraine included, and this highlights also that the challenge is not just about Ukraine. The challenge is against the very basis of how we built our societies. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Kara. Now I turn it to Magnus Christensen, who will address how can the West defend its own values.
Well, thank you very much. Just a few words about the challenge. As I see it, what we're talking about here is fundamentally anti-liberalism. That is that what we see in Europe today, not just from Russia, but in Europe today, there is a severe pressure on the open society in some kind of Popperian sense. That is democracy, market economy, and the rule of law. And so what I'm going to say about defense here concerns not every populist party or every anti-establishment party that has some kind of influence, but rather this very fundamental challenge to the open society. Now, but I think the fundamental question to me is, what do we mean with attraction? I mean, what happens when someone is attracted to something? On a personal level, I think I'm very often amazed when I see that a certain person is actually very attracted to another person, and it's really puzzling. What does this person really see in another person? And you can ask the question, what makes certain people attracted to bad girls, and what makes certain people attracted to bad boys?
Wow.
And sorry? No, but bad girls. Bad girls and bad boys in the sense that we show something that we believe is a dark side to our personalities. A dark side and something which is deeply psychological here. And as a matter of fact, the early research on this was very much about psychological sexuality. So scholars like Adorno, from asking the question, what is authoritarian personality? And some of the key answers to this very psychological research was that there are certain insecurities in a personality which leads to affirmation and authoritarian submission. So once again, there is something very dark here. Now, of course, I mean, this research is very much criticized. But I think there is one thing which we can actually pick from this research when we're actually studying politics, and that is that attraction is something that is conditional. So the first line, the first step in finding a strategy for defending the open society is actually to figure out under what conditions do we find these attractions. So, and here we'll just offer 3 of these conditions that maybe we can ponder upon, that I believe are necessary to understand our own vulnerabilities. And the first one, and perhaps the most important one, is systemic failures of the open society, of democracies, to be efficient when it comes to delivering welfare, prosperity, and order. And this is actually, if we connect this sort of theoretical language to what has happened in Europe after 2008, 2009, I would actually say that large parts of Europe are today in some kind of socio-economic shock. And first of all, there was this, the economic phase, and now we're beginning to see the political repercussions of this. So this is actually one of the key conditions which triggers this. The second condition, which is which opens up here for anti-liberalism, is what Samuel Huntington has called some kind of snowballing effect or demonstration effects. In the sense that the psychological effect is here that you look at your neighbor, and if the neighbor can do it, of course you get the idea that you can do it yourself. And in that sense, and furthermore, there is a demonstration effect when an authoritarian anti-liberal state actually succeeds in defeating a democratic state or an open society. That is something which is a demonstration effect par préférence. And if we, some of the leaders which have emerged and strengthened their position after 2008, Orban, Erdogan, and Putin, they are actually using these demonstrations effect to advance their positions in European politics. The third factor, the third condition, is something that I would call innovation, not confrontation. Because the natural instinct here is to look at history. Democracies have been challenged before, so why not just look at history and we can learn something about how to defend democracies. Well, first of all, these demonstrations they resonate in social media today in a way that they did not do in the 1920s and 30s and in the 1960s when they were challenged in the Third World War, in the Third World. So, by saying this, my argument is here that today authoritarian anti-liberal regimes will, of course, not look like they did in the 1920s and 30s. So Nazism, fascism were unique answers to an historical situation, whereas today we can see innovation, some kind of experiment with digital or electronic dictatorship. And the response is, because it's not about propaganda. I think that's a misconception here, because very often there's a discussion about what comes from Kremlin as propaganda. I think that it's better to understand this as some form of exploring of the fact that media is the message, and so it's not a control of a message, it's not a control of a story, it's rather a way of disrupting the ability to have control of a story. And in that sense, we might, and this kind of electronic dictatorship is only one way of finding an invention, some other form of authoritarianism that we have not seen before, which leaves us rather vulnerable. So just a few comments on how I think we can counter these 3 different conditions. When it comes to the economic and socioeconomic shock, I believe that this is perhaps the greatest challenge, because capitalism has been able to reinvent itself many times before, and this is indeed a time where the market economy and our open societies needs to reinvent some kind of growth to stop stagnation in many parts of the OECD area. This is really fundamental in order to bolster some kind of defense for the open society. Secondly, in order to deny Russia a demonstration effect, it is very important that to support Ukraine. So maybe this is the other point here. If Kiev fails and if Ukraine is defeated, other countries in the region, where Moldova doesn't have a functioning government, it doesn't have a deal with the IMF. Georgia, although they want to portray themselves as a success story, it's very much a struggling democracy. If we are not successful in denying Russia in its attack on Ukraine, we will actually hand out the demonstration effect of an authoritarian regime in our neighborhood. So that's the second thing, and that's a military response. The third thing, and that concerns to the innovation part. The only thing we can do is actually, in an open society, is to debate and to ideologically challenge. It is much more difficult today with media and the ability to spread lies and rumors, but ultimately that is perhaps, it's a boring answer, it's a long-term answer, it's something we have to work on day to day, hour for hour, but an open society can ultimately only defend itself against these sort of electronic dictatorship tendencies with an open debate and ideological challenge.
Excellent. Excellent. We've had 3 really terrific presentations about what is the challenge that we're facing, and we're starting to get into how we can respond to this. But I wanted to just pick up on a few things that were mentioned, and then we'll move to a Q&A. I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you, Andras, about how do you see this playing out? The things that you're describing, migration crisis, other examples you're using. Do you see Russia's ability to utilize and stir up these tensions in Europe, thereby reducing European unity? Do you see this increasing, or do you see us actually now kind of waking up and responding to this?
Well, before I move on to that, do you have?
And please feel free to pick up on what the other
I just want to
speakers
say it's so important that you made the connection between Orban, Erdogan, and Putin, because they're the same breed. At the end of the day, they truly believe in what they call illiberal democracy, which is nonsense, but that's what they profess. And also, they believe that this is the way to hang on to power for a long, long time. So the attraction of Putin, while they hate him because they do hate him deep inside, but the attraction is that maybe he's giving up us a technology to hang on to power for a long time. Now, here's the problem with Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is contagious. He's contagious. So don't kid yourself that what's happening in Hungary is going to stay there. It's already visible that it's contagious. One thing that has not been, and I'll answer your question, but one thing that none of us have picked up on, it's corruption. Corruption is one of the ultimate and maybe most powerful tools of the Russians to interrupt our societies. And don't kid yourselves, it's not just Eastern Europe, it's not just Central Europe, it's also a number of institutions, a number of companies, corporations in Western Europe, in what we call the established democracies, where the Russians have been able to corrupt to the extent that these companies, these governments, these institutions tend to take decisions that favor Russia, or tend to take decisions that do not disfavor Russia, or tend to take decisions that at least is neutral. So this is something that I'd like you to think about. Now, to answer your question, anything that weakens the immune system of the West, he is going to do that. So ultimately, even if there had not been a connection between Russia and Russian efforts at the initial stage of the crisis, trust me, Russia is going to use this to weaken the West, to weaken the solidarity of the West, to weaken individual countries, and also to support his own political clients or political partners in the West. So I would say that you don't have to. I keep telling people when I speak about Russia, they say, yeah, you say this because you're a Hungarian. To this I usually add, just because I'm a Hungarian, I might still be right.
Thank you, Anders. Karo, you talked about the attractiveness of the Putin model in Russia itself. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the attractiveness of the Putin model and the effectiveness of the Putin model in kind of the post-Soviet space. Countries that have still Russian compatriots, as they call it, they share Russian culture, language. Wouldn't these people be more susceptible, perhaps, to the attractiveness of the Russian model than perhaps Western Europe?
Well, certainly many of the compatriots, I would say, are they're seduced by the message that Russia is strong again and they can feel proud in being Russian. I think we have to understand also that the support that this has generated from Russian society and also from Russian compatriots, it's not all manufactured from above. There were sentiments in the Russian population well before the annexation of Crimea, where you could see how people were yearning for more national pride and for a return to tradition. So what Putin and the Russian leadership did was actually using these sentiments that were already present in the Russian population. I also want to emphasize one thing. Since the annexation of Crimea, Russia's become a country where politics, in a way, is put on hold, and at the same time, everything is political. What T-shirt you wear, what music you listen to, even what cheese you eat. And this cuts through Russian society. You're either for the Russian political leadership or you're against, and then you're a patriot. If you're against Putin and the annexation of Crimea, then you're a national traitor. It cuts through Russian society, but it also cuts through the Russian diaspora. And so we can't just say that all compatriots are for Russia, I mean, for the Russian annexation of Crimea. It actually cuts through the diaspora, and we need to recognize this. It even cuts through, I would say, the Society of Russia Watchers. What's